So my name is Mike. I'm known as McGilla NER on the New England Writers page, and I'm one of the admins on there, co-host with Ed Condi and a whole bunch of other good folks. And Ken has been kind enough to be able to each year do some of these skill training seminars for people. I think it's a nice way, again, just a reminder in terms of, we kind of get stuck in a rut of what we're doing and how we ride, and there's just some good reminders about things that we can be doing to get a little bit better. Considering that the if you're not trained and if you're not doing the things that you should do, the consequences can be deadly. So it's why we feel New England Riders has always been a supporter of safety and that type of thing, training safety, which is why we do these. I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with Ken. Ken has a litany of things that he has done in his life, from being an author to being a writer for many motorcycle magazines, co-owner of the Non-Sport Bike Track Days, does a lot of training, street training with people, which is fantastic if you ever get a chance to be able to do that. And again, I've been riding for close to 53 years, 52 years at this point. I started riding when I was a kid, and I still do two track days a year. I've done dirt training with Ken. I feel like training is important no matter how long you've been riding. So without further ado, let's start with Ken on braking.
All right. Thanks, Mike. So this is a pretty broad topic, and I was showing Mike all my notes that I have, and it's pages long just on braking. So there's a lot of aspects of braking that it's so very easy for us to think about braking as just slowing and stopping a motorcycle. But as I share with my students, that braking is much more than that. It's also about direction control and stability control, using your brakes and which brake when, that whole thing. We did a seminar last year on which brake when, or I believe it was just solely on the rear brake. So what I thought we'd focus on, though, Mike and I were talking about, is to focus, and we're going to do trail braking again. Now, we've done trail braking before, but it just is a perennial question that I get about just clarification on what it is and how useful it is and what's it all about. And it comes up in topics all, including in this podcast I did with Mark Barnes, is that he had a very good question about that, in that over time, trail braking was early on was talked about more as a racer technique, and was something that you needed to sort of avoid when you were riding on the street. And if you're going to race, trail braking is something I'll describe what it is in a minute. Is something that you would need to do to be competitive. But on the street, it's something that typically you don't want to brake in a corner. That's what the MSF teaches. And so for super safety traction management, it does make some sense to not try to brake and corner at the same time, because you only have a certain amount of traction. And if you do two things too much, then you can lose traction. Of course, you can do that with one thing too much, but it's a little harder to even manage traction if you try to do two things at once. And what we're talking about here is braking into a corner. So let's define trail braking. I kind of already did, braking into a corner. And it's not braking in a corner. That's when you're in the corner and you go, oh, geez, you see some mid-corner problem and you then get on the brakes while you've already entered the corner. That's not trail braking. That's surviving. That's braking to avoid a hazard, or the turn tightens up, you screwed up, you came in too hot, and then you have to manage that. And sometimes leaning more should be your first solution. But if that can't happen, or if you're just haven't really leaned enough before, you're not going to suddenly become a superhero and lean past what you're comfortable with. So you may end up having to use the brakes. Braking in a corner is a very important technique, and you should be practicing that. We work on that in the parking lot course for that reason, because you have to be able to react in corners. Sometimes you're leaned over and something happens. You come around the corner and And there you got to really come to a stop, and sometimes a real quick stop. How do you do that without losing traction? So that right there, we'll talk about, just to introduce the trail braking topic, is that if you're leaned over and you come around a corner and there's sand all over the road and you feel like you have to absolutely stop, you can't avoid it. If you were to just grab the brakes, you're going to likely lose traction because you're already leaned over and the tires are already working to keep you upright while you're lean. So you got those lateral forces while you're leaned, and then you add brake forces, and that can easily exceed the available traction. So there are techniques for getting the bike stopped, but there's two of them as a general rule. And both of them are techniques that allow you to stop as quickly as you can without skidding, without losing traction. So you have to give up the lean angle to introduce the brakes. So just as a general rule, that's what it is. You give up the lean angle. What does that mean, though? It means you're going to go wide because you're no longer leaning in your curve. So that's the trick. But you have to practice that, because when things come up like that, there's no thinking. You have to just have it in your muscle memory, and you'll do what you're trained or not trained to do. Most people aren't trained, so what they do is panic, grab, and fall down, and they never even, oftentimes, ever reach the hazard that they were trying to avoid, because they just crash before they get there. So that was the idea behind the risk of braking in corners or while you're leaning. Now, trail braking is braking into a corner. Why is that different? Well, it means that it's a planned technique, and you see a corner ahead. Not every corner is a trail braking corner, and I'll talk about that some more too. But you see a corner, and I'm going to describe the most obvious scenario where you'll use trail braking, and that is a downhill tight corner. It can be a hairpin, or it can even just be a 90-degree turn, but something more than just a bend in the road. And the steeper, the better for our purposes here. So as you're approaching the turn, you see that this is coming up. So you're going to plan to apply the brakes to slow the bike down. Remember, you're going downhill, and so you have to accommodate enough brake force to get the bike to slow down against gravity, because gravity is wanting to push you down the hill. So you see that come, and you apply the brakes like you would. Everybody, slow down. That's nothing new there. But the difference between trail braking and what we're taught in the MSF is that you would release the brakes before you leaned in. That would be the wrong way to do it. It's the way that beginners are taught, because, well, they really are trying to keep it as simple as possible for raw beginners when it comes to training them in the MSF class. So I understand why they do that. But the reality is that as soon as you get out on the road, you really have to understand trail braking. So back to the conversation I had with Mark Barnes on podcast, he remembers the times when trail braking was like taboo. It was like, oh. So my first book, Riding in the Zone, I have a section in there about trail braking, and then I have a video that accompanies it, and I talk about trail braking and for street riders. And the book itself was really, I kind of targeted it to advanced intermediates, and even that would be sort of the general target audience. And I was interviewed on some radio interview, I forget what it was, but they said, aren't you concerned about mentioning trail braking to intermediate riders? And I said, no, because they're doing it anyhow. It's just that they're doing it wrong. Usually it's they're just not timing it upright, and, breaking into corners when it's important that they know that it's a technique and that it's a useful technique. So no, this is an important thing to have right from the beginning, really, in my opinion. But if you look at the video, which it's on YouTube, but I'm real cautious. I say, this is a technique that shouldn't be done, on the road, and unless it's, really needed and all this stuff. And that was in 2008. That's when the book came out. And so at that point, it was still very much a trail braking was like, I don't know about this for street riders. Well, since then, it's completely changed. I mean, Nick Einash at the Yamaha school, that's all they teach. It's just trail braking. I mean, that's not all they teach, but they are all about it. And so I've been all about it for quite a while now. So again, back up. What is it? It's when you're approaching that downhill hairpin or downhill turn, you're going to apply the brakes. But if I were to let go of the brakes while I'm still straight up and down, gravity is going to then continue to hurtle me down the hill. But I need to turn the bike. So if I let go of the brakes and gravity accelerates me, that is the equivalent. It's basically the same as if I were to get on the gas. A little different, but essentially the same. And when you get on the gas, you have to understand that when you start to roll on the throttle, you're telling the bike that you are done turning, not beginning turning, but that you're done turning and that the bike is going to start to stand up. So adding throttle is going to stand the bike up, but you haven't even gotten to the corner yet. So you want the bike to actually lean in. And if you're off the brakes and the hill is, careening you down the hill, now you're going to be fighting the acceleration of gravity and having to tip it in. And that's working against the geometry of the bike. So by applying the brakes lighter and longer, carrying the brakes down into the corner, holding the brakes as you tip in, and then releasing the brakes at about, give or take, halfway around the corner, and then accelerate out. So now you've used the brakes to help manage your direction control. So it's not just slowing, but it's also for direction control. And it would also be traction management, because if you let go of the brakes and then you have to wrestle the bike to get it to lean, you're using more traction. So you're having to give a pretty assertive counter steer. Whereas if you're using the brakes very lightly, I mean, trail braking is light. It's not heavy braking. That little bit of brakes will help the bike turn, because loading the front tire and compressing the suspension is going to encourage the bike to turn. Okay. Whereas on the gas, that your suspension is now extended and load is off the front tire. That's why the bike stands up. So you need to know, understand the timing of when you're applying the brakes, or just even deceleration and acceleration, and know that you have to do it at the right time so that the bike does what you want it to do. All right, you get on the gas too early before you're done turning, you're going to run wide at the exit. So you have to be patient. So we're going to talk more in detail about the technique of trail braking, but I just wanted to sort of put that in your head about why we would do it in a scenario where that would make sense. And so let's start.
Hey, Ken, if I can, before we go further, I
Yeah.
just wanted to let people know, if you have questions as we go, if you'd use the chat, you can put them in the chat, and I'll kind of stop Ken as we get a few questions in there so we can get them answered for you along the way.
Cool. Yeah, I hope there are a lot of questions on this. This is a there is nuances to this too that I probably don't cover sometimes, because I try to cover it in a way that sort of covers the whole, wide range of scenarios. But you may actually have a scenario that I haven't thought of that I would love to hear about. We can talk about that. So let's back up a little bit more and describe what trail braking is and what it isn't. So we talked about what it isn't. It's not braking in a corner. It's braking into the corner. How hard you brake and how long you brake, it's all about timing and intensity. So you can brake early and light and then taper off lightly, or you can come into a corner hot and with hard brakes, but then you have to taper off, because as you add lean angle, you can't have hard braking, because now we're back to the scenario where you're going to lose traction. So you have to manage, as soon as you start tipping in, you have to be releasing brake pressure. All right. So that's sort of the trick, the like, rub your belly while tapping your head part of trail braking. And I think that's why, they're caution about absolute beginners doing it. It's not that hard, but understand that you're trying to manage that traction, and that's what's important. So like on the racetrack, I mean, I'll come into corners, I'll be braking hard where the rear wheel is skipping off the rear tire, off the pavement, and I can still trail brake in. but only because I'm on race tires on a dry, hot, hot tires, hot pavement, and I can get the bike on its nose like this and still trail brake in because I'm managing the traction. So as soon as I start tipping in, I'm releasing the brake though. So I know that front tire can handle it. How do you know? Well, that's part of the thing about, on the racetrack is that you get repetitive laps and you get to really know what your tires can do. And so that's really one of the things that you can develop if you come to the training days, the track training days, is to understand really how capable your tires are. You also get to learn, to read the feedback of tires, and that helps also so that you get an idea of just how far you can go with your braking. But there's no need to go crazy with it, especially on the street. But where you, again, back to where we are, we're braking, and then as we're tipping in, we're releasing. So where do you tip in? Well, I mean, where do you start to release? Well, that's again depends on the corner. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Let's find out where we are here. Okay, everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah. So this is a typical decreasing radius turn. So we're going to the right. This red is the braking zone. The orange and then the yellow is the transition zone. So look at how long I am braking into this corner. So if you were to think about the MSF way, I'm just going to call it that, you would be releasing your brakes back here. Well, pretend this is a downhill, like a steep downhill, you're going to be fighting the bike to keep it in tight, in your lane. So the brakes are going to help you keep the bike in the lane. And here's where I'm tapering off the brakes. That's why it's going from red, which is the harder braking. Almost all my braking, my slowing is done straight up and down. So that's why the red stops about right here, and then it goes to orange. For that very reason is that I'm starting to lean the motorcycle in. I can't be on heavy brakes. So I'm releasing the brakes as I'm tipping the bike into the lean. Now at this point in here, now I'm going to talk about some of the nuances of trail braking, and that is that I release the front brake because I don't want to over slow. First time people start to trail brake, they tend to over slow because you're used to having all your brakes done back here. That if I ask you to then brake deeper into the corner and you don't adjust the intensity or the pressure, you're going to, from what you're used to, because you have a muscle memory, you're going to end up slowing down too much. So you have to then recalibrate that is when you start to really practice your trail braking. Back to this diagram here, I'm braking. At some point, I really don't want to slow anymore. And my front brake is my slowing brake. It's really my power brake, whereas the rear brake is my control brake. And so that I still want to control the bike, and it might be that I still want to scrub off maybe 1 mile per hour more, or maybe not. But the rear brake is going to keep the bike tight. So I'm on the rear brake right in here only. So I'm now only on the rear brake. Now, there was a time when people thought that trail braking was rear brake only. Well, it's not. Probably, maybe so. Maybe it was thought of that way back when because of this part here, where you focus on using the brake again as a direction control tool, not as a slowing tool. Because I'm not slowing anymore, but I'm starting to pick up the throttle, and I'm still on the brakes. Like I would even be on the rear brake. I'm talking brake, not brakes. On the rear brake against the throttle just for a little bit here, just a little bit. The overlap would be half a second. So trail braking is it can be both brakes. It can be both brakes. It can be one brake, and it can be deceleration. So what I mean by that is that even you're decelerating, if you've got a lot of engine braking, you downshift one time more than normal to really end up relying on the engine, which is bad technique, by the way. Not engine braking itself, but relying only on engine braking. That's poor technique. The brakes are there for a reason. Your revs should be where you need them to be to then be able to drive out of the corner, okay, not to slow down. Now, that said, engine braking is useful because it's rear brake force that helps stabilize the bike. But so does rear brake. But the engine braking itself also kind of carries that rear brake force along with your rear brake into this area here. So, but if you ended up, like say this corner here is flat and you come in, at a conservative pace, it might be that you don't have to brake for this corner, but you have to still decelerate, and you would decelerate probably in the same zone here, but you're going to carry your deceleration all the way around the corner. So even though it's not brakes, it's deceleration, but the timing is still going to be about the same. All right. You'd start picking up your throttle maybe a little bit early, maybe not, maybe probably not actually. So, and again, it depends on your bike. Some bikes have a lot of engine braking, some bikes have less engine braking. So that's just something to keep in mind, that trail braking, I call this trail deceleration. And it's something that, we do. We don't brake for every corner, no way. And we also don't trail brake for every corner. So a lot of corners that you really, excuse me, trail braking is really going to be for those corners where you're coming in at a fairly good clip, and you have to then, it's a tight enough turn that the speed goes from, high to pretty low, and then to accelerate back out. And now it can be different shapes. This one here is an obvious one where you would trail brake in deep because the corner tightens up. If I were to start to get on the gas back here, and let's talk about acceleration timing. If I were to get off the brakes back in here, about halfway around the corner, excuse me, and I got on the gas, the bike would want to stand up like we were talking about, and you would have a hard time staying in your lane. You would end up being pointed out on the oncoming lane. So you have to just, whether you're braking or decelerating, just using engine braking, you have to be patient. Now, one thing about engine braking only is that this is kind of puts you in a limbo situation here where the bike isn't really, you're coasting almost. You're not coasting because your clutch isn't in. You should have your clutch out. Do not coast through corners. Like I see that sometimes, people going through hairpin turns, squeezing the clutch and coasting through them. That's terrible technique. Your bike is very unstable when it's not being driven. So you want to get that bike, get the sort of tension in the chassis, tension in the drivetrain. So no matter what you're doing, whether you're braking or decelerating, right in here is where you're going to still be patient. This is the patience section right here of the corner. And this is when people start to get on the gas too early, that they end up out here, and then they have to kind of fix it out here and make another second turn just to stay in their lane. So you have to be patient about your throttle. What else about that? Like I say, using engine braking is fine, but it should be more for corners where you're just sort of needing to scrub off a little speed. So you just kind of feather the throttle off, turn, and then get back on the gas. Every corner you want to slow for. Now, do I mean slow? Do you have to slow? No, but you want to stop your acceleration before any corner. Even a bend in the road, where if you just go from 40 miles an hour, feather off to 38 miles an hour, make your turn, and then get back to 40, 42. You're working with the chassis, right? Deceleration is like braking. It's going to load the front tire, and it's going to help or encourage the bike to turn. Okay, that's just how it works. Now, you may be asking, well, if I brake hard, my bike wants to stand up. Or if I brake hard, the bike's hard to turn in. And that's true. That's absolutely true. Which is why that's not what trail braking is. Your braking, if you're doing any hard braking, is all the way back here in this red zone. And then this is all tapered off. By the time you're here, I've got 90% of my slowing done, but pretty much before I tip in. It might be a little bit after I tip in, but I'm immediately starting to release the brakes. But I might be at, and what I mean by release is I don't let go of them. So I'm braking, I'm tipping in, and as I'm leaning, I'm just starting to ease off the brakes. So I might still be at need 10% brakes in here. It might be at 5% brakes here. And by the time I'm at full lean, I'm at 0% brakes. And now I'm starting to transition to the throttle.
Can you speak to people with bikes that have linked brakes?
Yep. Great question. It's on my notes. That link brakes are their proportions. So it still works where it's just going to be less effect, because when you use both brakes, use one brake, some of the other brake is going to be activated. But if you use both brakes in, you release the front brake and you carry the rear brake a little bit, you're going to have a little bit of front brake, but it's small. It's not a big deal. You're still going to use this technique will still work for you. And some bikes, they're calibrated differently, but linked brakes still work with this technique. And just understand that you are getting a little bit of front brake pressure, whereas those of us who don't have linked brakes, we have zero front brake pressure when we're using the rear brake. Excuse me. Okay. Any questions so far?
Just the ones I've given you so far, Ken.
Okay. I've gone through this spiel so much in my career that it's just want to make sure I'm not ripping through it too fast. Okay, so another how-to. You may have seen when I was doing my demonstration that I was using 2 fingers. Now this is another beginners. If you're a new rider and you just graduated from your MSF basic rider course, they said 4 fingers, 4 fingers, 4 fingers. Again, that's for training. It has some sense to it. They've eased off on that if a student chooses to use 2 fingers or less than 4, that to not badger them the way we used to back in the old days. But why do we use 2 fingers? Well, modern brakes typically have plenty of brake power at the lever, where we don't need 4 fingers to get the power we need with 4 fingers. We can do it with 2. What does that do for us? Well, it ends up being that if we do that, these fingers, my ring finger, my pinky, and my thumb can remain on the throttle. All right, so I still have good control, and then my 2 fingers are going to do the braking. Also, when I'm coming into a corner and I'm rolling off the throttle and I'm reaching for the brake in one smooth action like that, and as I'm then squeezing and I'm tipping in, I can then roll on the throttle as I ease off the brake. So with the 2 fingers, it allows me to then have the control of the thumb, the ring finger, and the pinky to manage the throttle, while the fingers, the index and the middle finger, are managing the brakes. So it's really important technique for when you really want to get this technique to be very precise. It's hard to do it with 4 fingers. You can do it, but then you're like rolling on the throttle just with this part of your hand, and that's pretty tough. So 2 fingers. And I've just mentioned the kind of the transition. I even like overlap a little bit I don't do this all the time, and not every corner, there's no absolutes, even though my second book is called Motorcycling the Right Way. There's no one right way to do it, but there are some wrong ways to do it. And so just keep in mind that there are, every corner you come to, you have to decide whether this is a trail braking turn, whether I need to be super smooth with it, how much am I leaning. If I'm all the way leaned over on my knee on the racetrack, I can't be abrupt. I'm going to lose traction. So I am as smooth as I can be. And then as I lean over, I'm releasing the brakes, and then I'm smoothly rolling on the throttle. I'm actually overlapping just slightly just so that I don't pitch the bike from brakes to accelerating. And now I've got a loading and unloading situation of the tires. So so tapering off, everything is smooth, everything, no spikes in load. So and that's the beauty of trail braking. Another reason why it's actually a stabilizing technique is because if you go into a corner the way most people do, you go in, you brake. Let's use that downhill hairpin because it just shows it the best way. Let me stop sharing here. So I'm going down the hill, and if I were to brake and then release the brake, that front, the motorcycle, the front suspension is going to spring up. So it's going to rebound. And then I'm going to tip into the corner and it's going to compress again. And then as I come around the corner and I get on the gas, it's going to extend again. So there's a lot going on. It's a compression, release, extension, tip in, compression, accelerate, extension. So what we're eliminating two of those actions by trail braking. So as we trail brake, we're on the brakes, we're still on the brakes as we tip in. So we've got the load, the compression of the front suspension, and then we're keeping that front suspension compressed as we tip in. Okay, so now I didn't have that rebound. And now as I come around the corner, I'm easing off the brakes, I'm getting on the throttle, I have one extension. Okay, so it's one compression event and one extension event, as opposed to two compressions and two rebounds, extension events. So that preserves traction. So you can argue that breaking into a corner, like for trail braking, there's a risk of losing traction. But the fact is that actually that technique preserves traction. Again, it takes some, you can't be a ham fist with it, but that's something that you learn. And again, trail braking is not like diving into a corner heavy duty. On the racetrack it might be, but on the street it's just braking nice and early and carrying your brakes past where you would likely, if you don't trail brake, you would carry your brakes past that point where you would have released the brakes and carry it into maybe, let's just say, give or take halfway around the corner. Again, as you're leaning in, you're releasing the brakes. So you're tapering off. That last bit of brakes is very light. I mean, you're just trying to, you might have 10%. You're getting 90% of your slowing done straight up and down. And as you tip in, you're just carrying you're at 10%, 8%, 5%, 0% at full lean, and then you're accelerating. Okay. Any questions yet, Mike?
No.
Okay. What else we got? Let's see. What haven't I covered about that? Yeah, so some corners just aren't trail braking turns. That's when I bring students out to street training, is I bring them to particular corners that I know, roads, including Mount Greylock. And if you know Mount Greylock, there's some corners that they're hairpins, and it's the going down. So going uphill, trail braking isn't really used, but engine braking is, because gravity, if you're going uphill, if I use the brakes, I'd slow down too much. So if I'm going uphill, I'm going to just use my engine braking and deceleration, trail deceleration. And because I don't want to, if I'm leaning in going uphill and I'm tipping in like this, if I get on the gas too soon, again, I'm going to go wide. So I have to decelerate and hold the deceleration around the corner until the bike starts getting pointed toward the exit, and then I start to roll on the gas. So that's, again, the timing is still critical. So it's still that slowing into the corner and accelerating out of the corner. Okay, and it's not slowing before the corner. Yes, you're slowing 90% of your slowing is done before the corner, but then you're bringing that corner, that braking into the corner. So like I say, there's not every corner is a trail braking turn where I have to bring students to a particular roads that really allow us to, really focus on being able to work on the technique. One way you can do that, if there's, because some corners are like, well, this could be a trail braking corner if I was going faster. So the faster you go, the more likely you'll need trail braking. But if you can still still practice by upshifting to a gear taller than you would normally, so that you're not relying on engine braking, it's going to force you to use your brakes. So that's something that that is for training. You can do that, and so oftentimes I'll tell people, all right, I want you to go up a gear. And whereas in the past, normally you would be in, say, third gear, and that would give you enough engine braking that you would basically not need brakes, or you would need very, very little brakes. And then the deceleration would then finish up as you turn. But bring it up a gear, and now you're going to careen down the hill again, especially when it comes to downhills, and then you're going to be forced to brake. And now you're going to be able to practice your trail braking. If you don't practice it like anything else, you don't get good at it, and when you need it. What else? Okay. There's no questions about trail braking. We talk about this, and you get a lot of practice with this with the non-sport bike training day. And that's something that you get a lot of practice with, especially at Palmer. Especially when you go the clockwise direction, you got a steep downhill, which is a lot of fun. So let's talk a little bit then, if we're done with trail braking, about the rear brake. And I did a whole seminar on that last time. We got like 15 minutes or so I'm just going to hit on that. And it plays into the trail braking actually, because I just talked about finishing the trail braking technique in a corner using the rear brake. And why is that? Well, I mentioned it keeps the bike tight, and there's geometry to that helps, that when you apply the brakes, like if this is my rear contact patch and this is my front contact patch, I'm going this way, that if I still carry the rear brake pressure, it just almost kind of pivots the bike around that contact patch, the rear tire contact patch, and it just kind of drags the bike into the turn. Again, when you decelerate or when you brake, that's going to going to keep the bike tight. So when you accelerate, it's going to raise the bike, and then finish the turn. It'll run it wide. So using that rear brake at the end of the corner is really very, very beneficial. I do that all the time with when I'm in Europe on the hairpin turns. I want to show you a video. Let's do this. I can find it. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So this is on my YouTube channel. Can everybody see this video?
Yep.
Yeah, can see that? All right. So this is actually Ed Condi and Tony's track days. And then me, I'm on my Tiger. And we're going, this is the Duchess trip from 2 years ago, I guess. And I want you to watch Tony's brake light. Okay, so this is a downhill twisty road, and I'm going to play it. I'm going to put it in my full screen. You can still see that, right, Mike? Full screen.
Looking good.
All right, so here we go. Now I want you to watch the Tony's trail. His brake light. Some of these corners you're going to see his brake light's on. Watch him carry it. He's carrying it. He's not off the brakes yet. He's not off the brakes. Now he's off the brakes. You see how far around the corner he kept that. He kept those brakes on. Again, watch the brake light. Watch the brake light. This one he's going to release early because the corner was ended pretty early. So he kept it around about halfway. Now watch his brake light here. Braking, 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 braking. And now he accelerates. Okay, you see how long he had that rear brake on? Here again, look at that brake light. He's off and then he's back on, which is something that I'm not sure why he did that, but here's another one. So he's on the brakes right here, right there. Look at how he's carrying it around. That's trail braking. And once the corner starts to straighten out, he can release the brakes. So typically, when I'm coaching this, and I learned this from Eric Trove from Staying Safe, and he writes for Rider Magazine, is that if you hold the brakes for at least 2.5 to 3 seconds, that's trail braking. That is effective, where you're being smooth. If you're sort of jabbing the brakes and you're only on braking, turning in, then off the brakes, you're braking probably too abruptly, as opposed to brake. Hold the brakes light enough that you're not over slowing, and then you're tapering off the brakes. It should take 3 seconds to do that. All right. So if it takes you less than 3 seconds, just brake lighter. Okay. Because again, if you're braking harder, you're getting that load, that pitch, you're upsetting the chassis. If you give it that 3 seconds, then it's going to be a nice gradual pitch, and then it's going to be a nice gradual extension as you accelerate out. But that was an example of just when you're riding behind somebody that knows what they're doing, you're going to see that brake light come on and hold that brake light around the corner. And that's what trail braking is. And you can see how smooth he was. I mean, it's just buttery smooth. So, okay, we've got a few more minutes. The rear brake. Why do we call it the control brake? And it's kind of talked about it where for finishing a corner, it's going to help the bike stay tight. But if you think about a rear brake when you're straight in line, and if this is my front brake, my front contact patch, and this is my rear contact patch, go back like here. If I were to not use my rear brake and I brake hard with the front, fishtailing happens, right? If I use the rear brake, as long as I've got contact at the surface, at the road surface, that's going to actually stabilize that and not allow it to fishtail. Okay, it's actually going to pull the contact patch of the brake is going to actually pull in an opposite direction. It's going to actually put tension in the chassis, and it's going to encourage the bike to stay in line. Whereas if you don't use the rear brake, it tends to end up being a little less stable. So that's one use of the brakes, the rear brake. Both brakes, always use both brakes. The rear brake going into a corner, as any sort of braking actually. When it comes to emergency braking, both brakes, but there's a point where you may need to ease off the rear brake if you don't have ABS, which most everybody does, because as you brake hard, the bike's going to pitch onto its nose and it's going to make the rear tire super light and it's going to make it easy to skid. So that would be a reason to then, well, you would still use both brakes, but you might have to ease off the rear brake. That's a technique we used to teach a long time ago. But again, now there's ABS and you can kind of get away with that now. If you do emergency braking practice, which I hope you are, and if you brake hard, which brake is going to be the one that you feel the ABS in first? It's going to be the rear brake. It's because you've unloaded the rear tire. So that's that's just the basic dynamics of that. Something else I was going to say about that. I forget what it was. So using that rear brake is just as a general rule, is going to allow that bike to be more stable. When you're doing tight U-turns, and we're going to talk about that, I think at our next talk, is slow speed maneuvers. By using the rear brake, you've now got the same dynamic going. When you're you're counterweighting and you're making that turn, and you hold that rear brake, and it's going to control your speed. Because remember, when you're doing a tight U-turn, you're doing like 4 miles an hour, 5, maybe 6. And if you go to, from 6 to 7 or 8 miles an hour, you're going to then run wide. So that rear brake, again, it's not a power brake. If you use the front brake doing that, which you can, you'd have to be super light with it. If you use the rear brake, it's not going to over slow you, but it has the control where you can just keep that bike at 6 miles an hour, or but if you go to 6.5 miles per hour, that might be a little too fast, and you would need to lean more to stay in your desired radius. So that rear brake is really helpful in that case as well.
And another question for you, if you would.
Yeah.
Somebody who doesn't have ABS and they're starting to lose the rear tire, their question is, should they keep the brake on or release it at all?
So the MSF says keep it on. And why they say that is it's the less of two evils. So the idea being that if you were to skid the rear tire and it starts to fishtail and then you release the brake, the bike's going to want to flick. That rear tire wants to be behind the front tire, and it'll do it in an instant, and then it'll fling you off. That's a high side. So that's why there's a risk of letting off the rear brake. If there's any sort of fishtailing or any lean at all, it's going to flick back, and then it could launch you. So the other evil, though, or the other option, is to keep the rear brake locked, and then you just fishtail through it, and you keep your eyes up, and you'll pretty much naturally steer it through, and the thing will hopefully come to a stop. Now, I've certainly seen where people will do that, and it just starts to amplify, and suddenly you get flung off, anyhow. More times than not, it's because we try to correct it, and just like in a car, if you overcorrect, suddenly you're spun around. So if it starts to fishtail a little bit, you kind of need to relax and release the brake, lightly, and because you can also release the brake lightly. If you just snap off the brake, then it could, sort of jolt you. But if you're skidding and you start to ease off the brake, at some point it's going to regain, and it might be just a little softer regaining of grip. So, but what the real thing is don't do that. Now it's hard, rear brakes, rear tires want to skid because of what I talked about. You're unloading the tire. So you have to practice. And if you don't have ABS particularly, you got to practice, because in an emergency situation, there's no thinking. It's just doing. Your muscle memory has to be on. And it depends. If you get on a new bike, you should practice and get in the parking lot and practice. That's the first thing I do when I'm on a new bike. If it's a rental bike or somebody else's bike that I'm riding, is I just make sure I got a feel for the brakes right away, so that I can at least get an idea that I'm not going to overbrake or underbrake. So practice, practice, practice. Can't tell you enough about that. What was another pretty good thing I was going to mention? I don't remember what it was now. So there's so much to talk about with this stuff. Yeah. Where are we at here? We're almost done. Any other questions?
No other questions.
Braking. What else can we talk about? There's something else. Oh, here's another thing. When you come to a stop, now let's do the downhill stop. So you've got a stop sign at the bottom of a pretty steep hill. If you were to just use the front brake, you're going to get a lot of nose pitch. Again, you're downhill, so you're already pointed downhill. And then you get on the brakes, and the bike's going to want to pitch forward. If you actually apply the rear brake first before you apply the front, I'm just talking about rear front, because it's not an emergency. This is just coming to a stop at the bottom of the hill. It actually will help the bike squat. It'll keep that rear a little bit more in contact with the rear, with the pavement. So rear front, and then it won't nose up so much. It'll just kind of squat a little bit better. Little things like that. Another thing is when you come to the stop, you should be coming to the stop with the rear brake at the last 3 or 4 or 5 feet. I see way too many riders come into stops with their outriggers. Their feet are out, afraid they're going to fall over. You really want to get into the habit of having your left foot down, right foot finishes the stop on the rear brake. Okay. Why? Because then you're not coming to a stop where you're relying only on the front brake. I see too many riders just like coming to these abrupt stops. It's just a rookie thing to do. You just use the rear brake. If you're afraid you're going to fall over, you got other problems there. I mean, this is just coming to a stop. Get used to coming to a stop with 1 foot down. Once you stop, you can put both feet down, but use that rear brake. Here's a little tip for that, is that when you're coming to a stop and you want the bike to lean left because you want to put your left foot down, keep the right foot on the rear brake, is you can counter steer. People say that counter steering doesn't happen below some miles per hour. That's BS. You can actually counter steer your bike at 0 miles per hour. But as you're rolling those last 2 or 3 miles per hour and you're starting to like tip the wrong way so that you have to, put both feet out, counter steer it. So press on the left handlebar and the bike will lean to the left. There's counter steering at really slow speeds. So, cool. Well, if there's no questions, let's wind it down.